yeah, sure. Well, good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Q Society of Australia, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and to extend a very warm welcome, as we just have, to our special guest, Mr. Robert Spencer, who's come all the way from America and he's here for the very first time, and we're so looking forward to hearing from him. My name is Vicky Jansen and I'm the Deputy President of the Q Society, the organising body behind this Robert Spencer tour. It's been made possible through both generous sponsorship and the many sacrifices of Q Society members and supporters, to whom we're all very grateful. We all know there's no such thing as a free lunch, and none knows us better than our very generous lunch sponsors. Their sponsorship has subsidised the public meetings to make them affordable for all. And so thank you very much to all those who are involved in those special lunches. And it would be very negligent of me not to particularly mention our President, Jeff Dixon, who has worked tirelessly up here to make this all possible, and we appreciate all the efforts of all the people and supporters in Queensland. Now, before we go any further, it's unfortunately necessary for me to read a legal announcement, which in itself highlights one of the major concerns facing free democracies. So please note, Victoria's Racial and Religions Tolerance Act 2001, otherwise known as Victoria's Blasphemy Law, is a serious concern for Q Society. As we are incorporated in Victoria, this law may even apply to statements made in other states. And while we find this law abhorrent because it prohibits free speech and advances totalitarianism, we respect that the rule of law is a fundamental Australian value. And we affirm that in accordance with Section 11 of the Racial and Religions Tolerance Act, which permits conduct engaged in reasonably and in good faith in the course of any statement, publication, discussion or debate, made or held, or any other conduct engaged in, for any purpose that is in the public interest, or in making or publishing a fair and accurate report of any event or matter of public interest, that Q Society does act reasonably and in good faith. And there is little need to discuss whether the topic of Islam is in the public interest. We do not encourage or incite others to feel hatred, revulsion, contempt, or ridicule of Muslims in breach of the Racial and Religions Tolerance Act. However, we will discuss Islam, including its legal code, Sharia law, and the Islamic political, cultural, economic, social, or religious practices that we genuinely believe seek to undermine personal freedom and Australian values. Nor do we seek to generalise about Muslims, and so will not generalise that just because some Muslims are successful and integrated, that there is nothing to worry about at all. If there are problems in certain sections of the Muslim community, we will discuss these as we would discuss problems in any other group. If anyone in the audience feels, that's very subjective, feels emotions of anger, or of being incited or provoked into negative feelings against Muslims because our speakers tonight refer to passages of Islamic scripture, history, or the conduct of certain Muslims in a critical manner, then we would ask that you please leave this venue and stop reading our material. You are welcome, of course, to speak to a Q Society member afterwards who can assist in explaining the context in which we discuss Islam. Finally, if anyone in the audience has come for the purpose of deliberately claiming offence as part of a premeditated legal action against Q Society, or without genuine good faith intentions, then please also leave now. You have been put on notice that your presence is simply a provocation and incitement to us. Thank you for your attention. That's a bit sad, isn't it? We have to say that, but there you go. Well, we advertised this tour with the theme Socio-Political Jihad, Conquering the West Without Swords, Guns or Bombs, and quite frankly, who needs them? While I was preparing for tonight, an old saying popped into my head that will be familiar to many. Actually, it's said in two ways. There's more than one way to skin a rabbit and more than one way to skin a cat. But I think we all agree it doesn't matter which way we do it, it's not looking good for the animal. So likewise, there is more than one way to undermine democracy, the rule of law, freedom, order, the institutions that we have, the values and the open culture that democratic societies enjoy. Having sat in numerous Islamic lectures in Australia, I'm aware that there are individuals who may not necessarily support the means of terrorists, yet there is growing support for their ultimate goal, to see Islam rise politically, legally and culturally. There is, if you like, violent and non-violent means to the same end, of promoting Sharia law and the Islamic State concept. I often say dawah and jihad are two sides to the same coin. Dawah being the peaceful invitation to accept the Islamic narrative. No matter what way the coin falls, both dawah and jihad effectively do the same job, and it's heads up for Islamic Sharia either way. Unlike totalitarian regimes, democracy by nature is very accommodating to this peaceful pillaging of society. It's not just the Muslim Brotherhood who have a documented strategy of what they call civilizational jihad. In 1980, the Islamic Council of Europe published a book titled Muslim Communities in Non-Muslim States, which outlined a strategy for the Muslim community on how to resist assimilation and become a majority. So this is not just a conspiracy of a few, radical people or an ideal of some, but it is a documented strategy. And with at least 85 to 100 Sharia courts in Britain, Muslim enclaves and no-go zones for non-Muslims in many parts of Europe, we can see how successful that this strategy has actually been. Danish psychologist Nikolai Sennels describes this resistance to integration as a kind of cultural osmosis, where Western values don't quite penetrate the Islamic world, while Islamisation diffuses from the Muslim community into non-Muslim societies. But what of Australia? We keep hearing, well, it's different down under. Opposition spokesman on immigration, Scott Morrison, in a recent address said this, and I quote, "I do not see the experience of Europe on immigration as a prophecy for our own future in Australia. While I empathise," I heard that laugh, while I empathise with the comments of Angela Merkel and David Cameron as they battle with these questions in a European context, their immigration practice has followed a very different path to Australia, unquote. So it appears that successful integration is to be attributed to our immigration practice, something dependent upon Australian process rather than Islamic strategy, which seems to be irrelevant. I can assure you, having attended numerous Islamic lectures in Australia, the same strategy in Europe is alive and well here. My husband Mike and I attended one at the Melbourne University in 2008, where Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick assured the audience that there is no clash of civilizations, just a rise and fall of civilizations. And Quick noted that the decline of Western power and the rise of Islam would first take shape socially and then politically, socio-political jihad. That was their theology. So this is an Islamic expectation, and as we look around Australia, we see it as a growing reality. These comments were followed by some from Sheikh Chowdhury, who said that Australia was a young country and yet to cement its heritage and identity. And of course, the inference was that Islam would provide this cement. Well, how are we going? Is the evidence pointing towards the Scott Morrison narrative or the Sheikh Chowdhury one? Earlier this year, I had a visit to Monash University to discuss this little book, Salam Monash. I don't know if any of you saw the article by Miranda Devine. And we had a little chat about that. Now, while we're all hearing about social inclusion in Australia, with lots of public money thrown at that cause, this booklet essentially advises Muslims how they can avoid integration altogether. It directs them not just to Muslim institutions, mosques, prayer centres, and some of them are very dubious at that. It directs them to Islamic publications, Islamic websites, Islamic schools and other miscellaneous services and food outlets. but also it directs them to Muslim medical and dental practitioners. Non-Muslim practitioners will not be getting a slice of this business simply based on their lack of adherence to the Islamic faith. Now, if anyone else did that, it would be called discrimination. Isn't that strange? This blatant preferencing of Muslim-only medical and dental practitioners obviously falls far short of notions of the real social cohesion. Now, all this is quite interesting, given that on the students' rights page in this booklet, it's noted that excluding or isolating a person is a form of bullying. Wow, yet the whole booklet appears to exclude non-Muslim Australians. And if any of our international students thought they might be tempted to taste a little bit of freedom while they're here in Australia and choose for themselves what to wear, what to attend, or what to eat, I mean, after all, the Quran does say the food of the people of the book is lawful for Muslims, which makes it all quite irrelevant. There is a note in the Monash Muslim Students' Handbook reminding them it is the responsibility of each individual to be vigilant. That's what it says, to be vigilant in making sure that the food they consume is halal. Now, this is a public university mandating vigilance. That seems a bit like bullying to me. And then there's the halal helpline, of course, noted for any desperate situations. Sorry, we mustn't mock. One can't help but wonder if Malaysian author Syed Akbar Ali is right in his assessment that the halal industry is all a great burden upon people, a burden that we're not really alleviating for them here in Australia. It's part of a huge commercial industry driven by Islamist profiteers. Now, if people are coming to Australia for a bit of freedom, it's going to be very difficult for them when we keep validating all these practices. So let me ask a question in good faith, a question that any reasonable person might ask. How do we expect integration, shared culture, values and law when we promote segregation? When we can't share the same food, finance, doctors, dentists, public services, swimming pools and other public space. La Trobe University has its Muslim-only toilets and prayer rooms. The group Aussie Muslims is campaigning for exclusively Muslim prayer rooms in a WA hospital on the basis that they need to avoid the idolatry that may occur if they share. That was in their submission. Our public schools are adapting to a Muslim Perspectives curriculum project where, among many other things, not just female school swimming is recommended for the Muslim students, but Muslim-only swimming. I would call that an apartheid practice, wouldn't you? Some public schools are catering to this diversity by ensuring tuck shops are exclusively halal. Well, that's very diverse. No more ham sandwiches or bacon bits for these kids. And there are calls for legal pluralism by the peak Islamic body AFIC, the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils. Hizb ut-Tahrir openly advertises its three-point methodology on how to overturn democracy and impose the Islamic State. Seditiously circulating booklets like this, Democracy is a System of Kufr, the infidel, and actually in that booklet it forbids support of democracy and the rule of law. We picked that up in Sydney. And the government has committed Australia to support Sharia finance and innovation of the Muslim Brotherhood to undermine Western economies. We have a Sydney council who's been boycotting Israel and a Melbourne council employing a Muslim outreach officer to educate the community about Islam, because that's what we all need. And all this with public money. And to give substance to our concerns, the recent report by legal academics Anne Black and Kerry Sadiq finds that a system of pluralism based on Sharia law abounds in Australia. So that's the official report. It abounds already. A system endorsing polygamous and underage marriages in contravention of the Marriage Act. On and on and on it goes. The social and legal framework for little Islamic states in the making popping up everywhere. Perhaps, as Mr. Morrison claims, our selective immigration policies are more robust than Europe. However, our social policies appear to be heading us in exactly the same direction. And to ignore the social cost will be to our own peril, because, I don't think any of us wants to be that skinned rabbit. It would be an oversight to only mention the challenge of this peaceful pillaging of Western society when reports confirm there's also an overrepresentation in violent crime, suggesting the fostering of a culture of violence. Now, that's not something we're normally allowed to say. But in a report by Phyllis Chesler, it's noted that in Europe, 96% of the perpetrators of honour killings, we're talking about Europe, are Muslims, and allegations of unacceptable westernisation accounted for 71% of these crimes in Europe and 91% in North America. So the reason these girls were killed was because of unacceptable westernisation in a Western country. Bad attitudes towards things Western abound, and building up Islam rather than a healthy respect for Western freedoms and Western law may ultimately convert these bad attitudes into bad actions. We don't see a lot of figures published here, but actually The Age recently reported that in 2008, 42% of the clients of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights reported domestic abuse. That's 42%. But last year, that figure rose to 80% of the Muslim women. Now that's a very sad thing in Australia. Honour killing is just the extreme end of domestic abuse, and inadvertently promoting Sharia in any form is a reckless pursuit on part of democratic governments. We all know there's a door in and no door out. It's universally agreed about these apostasy laws. So promoting Islam at all is a reckless pursuit of any government. So to conclude, I'd like to highlight that this is essentially a battle of ideas manifesting at the extreme end in terrorism. Not only are we engaged in an asymmetric war militarily, but the ideological battle is also an asymmetric one. While pastors, of course one of them's in the room tonight, Pastor Scott, has been taken before the courts accused of mocking and vilifying Islam, the spokesman for the Islamic Council of Victoria, he's a partner in the comedy act Fear of Brown Planet. He received a government grant to mock and vilify white people and non-Muslims, $150,000 I believe. So non-Muslims get fined and taken before the courts for this mocking and vilifying, while Muslims get public grants because comedy's good for mental health. That was a Vic Health grant. And when I attended the VCAT hearing to stand with Pastor Scott, as they stood accused on this vilification charge, there were two burqa-clad women at the back of the hearing one day. And when Judge Higgins entered the room, everyone stood, as you do, to acknowledge the judge. They would not stand, they remained seated, and we were overheard saying, "We won't stand for an infidel judge." That was in a vilification hearing. Now that just makes a complete mockery of it. And I was quite amazed to read the argument of the defence lawyer of the Muslim who called the Australian Jewish soldier who returned from Afghanistan, and I quote, "a dirty animal 1,000 times worse than a pig." And his lawyer, in his defence, said the alleged comments were made in a political context and were not necessarily offensive. And then the barrister added, "Insults are a legitimate part of the political discourse." Interesting, isn't it? If the word Muslim was substituted for the word Jew, would any lawyer be game to uphold that argument? Absolutely not. Well, that's a little bit about where we are in Australia. Don't give up. There will be time for questions at the end of the evening, but now it's my pleasure to ask Warren Raymond. Where's Warren? Oh, g'day. Warren, and he's another Q Society board member, and he's going to give us a few insights into Europe just before I introduce our main speaker and special guest, Robert Spencer. Thanks, Warren.
That was great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for turning out in such great numbers to defend freedom and democracy in Australia. It's been a hectic tour, and it's been a very interesting year. Earlier this year, the Ivory Coast, has anybody ever heard of the Ivory Coast? Yes. The Ivory Coast fell to Islam. I think they had something like 20% Muslims. And the fact that they burned about 1,000 Christians and a church made it clear from the beginning that the American administration, the Obama regime, let's call it Obama regime, that's what it is, and the Clintons, always helpful to bring freedom and democracy to the Muslim nations. to accept it, to legitimize it. So we have now another Muslim nation in Africa, and the jihad rages in Nigeria, and in many other places, always in about 30 theaters of war around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I left Europe when I was a young man, and I returned some years later to find myself in Eurabia. Have you ever heard of Eurabia? Well, you know, Europe slept and slept around, and everybody had a lot of fun, and they forgot to produce children. So this is what the problem is nowadays. When I look around, everywhere we go, we see aging populations and no kids. And to make up for this, we see increasing numbers of Muslims who make up for this deficit. And this is totally in line with what our governments expect us to accept. So that time, everybody was aspiring in the early 70s. Everybody was aspiring to have a good car, a better house, a job, and so in the meantime, our law is being changed. The socialists are advancing, and you may know about Germaine Greer. Anybody knows Germaine Greer? Have you ever heard of Germaine Greer? She's one of these spiritual seekers, you know. She's still looking for herself somewhere in India at the moment. And she said, it's too bad that we can't have Marxism without Sharia. So she changes, you know, the bra burners from then and where they are now looking for the burqa, it looks like. It seems to be the case. I want to tell you a few things about France. France has 850 no-go zones, and I happened to be there in Strasbourg some 6 or 7 years ago when Muslim Allahu Akbar screaming Muslims were burning the cars in front of the hotel where I was staying in Strasbourg. They burned all over France about 10,000 cars, 400 businesses, and I don't know how many buses, and some buses with people inside. The French government, you know Sarkozy. Sarkozy is a so-called right-winger. He's a person who believes that you cannot defend yourself in your own home with a weapon. This is something I find a little bit disturbing for a right-winger. And he was very strong. He called them racaille, which means rabble. And of course, the Muslims complained, and they complained also to Rupert Murdoch, who Rupert Murdoch, News Corporation, you know. Who? Rupert Murdoch. You have never heard of Rupert Murdoch? Okay, good. But he happens to be financed by a Saudi prince, who called him and said, please change it instantly to youths. They are not Muslim riots, they are youth riots. And they corrected it. And they also built these youths who ran away from the police, who had stolen the car, and hold themselves up in a building where there was a power generator. They were electrocuted. That's why the riot started originally. There were 2 youths, they had a stolen car, they ran away, they were hauled up in a powerhouse, and then they were electrocuted, and the police was blamed. The police was dragged in front of the courts after that. The 2 policemen that were chasing them were brought to trial. So I mean, it's all a bit confusing, isn't it? And then they built them a monument. And nowadays, both parties in France, the so-called left and the so-called right, they are going there and they put flowers there to honor these unfortunate youths who happen to be killed. So it's a bit strange. A few months later, after this incident, I happened to find myself in Guam, where I had a business, and I met a Frenchman who just came back from an extended holiday in Tahiti. And we were talking, and he said, I asked him about the Islamization of France, and he said, it's no problem, it's all good. I said, you don't worry, you have no problem. I mean, 10,000 cars burned, and huge disaster for the economy and everything. And he said, no, it's good, it's very good. He said, it's very good for business. I said, what business are you in? He said, he's a car dealer. So I mean, there's like Vicky said there's different ways to skin a cat. You can, you know. I mean, it's the same thing when I had a little problem a while ago with an imam. He was offended because I opposed the mosque, and dragged me through the paper, and I shouldn't have the right to freedom of speech. There was a website where I posted this apparently is very offensive to Muslims. Nobody left, so I suspect there are no Muslims here, nobody against freedom of speech. Okay, anyway, so what happened was the imam became very irritated in these negotiations that we had to engage in. So we're facing off against each other, and the imam became very aggravated, and he said, you want to stop Islam? You cannot stop Islam. Nobody can stop Islam. Islam is like a tsunami. So, tsunami? I said, well, tsunami is a natural disaster, isn't it? So, natural disaster. So I said, but that means Islam isn't it a man-made disaster? So that wasn't exactly soothing for his nerves, I can tell you. But there was a way out of this, and there are many ways to skin a cat, like Vicky said. There's also some good news because Ezra Levant, who had similar problems when he published the cartoons, the Mohammed cartoons. Have you ever heard of the Mohammed cartoons? Yeah, okay. Ezra Levant in Canada is a young man, is a lawyer, and he has a mouth. He can talk. And he videotaped the mediation sessions with one of these human rights star chambers, where the Inquisition basically that we face. When we say anything negative about Islam, we have to face these star chambers. And they have a 100% conviction rate, is that right? Or had at least a 100% conviction rate until that happened. But Ezra Levant taped all this and succeeded in winning it. And because of this, he brought all these things out in the open. The freedom of speech laws, which were very oppressive in Canada, the hate speech laws, are going to be repealed. It looks like it, at least. I wouldn't hold my breath, but Stephen Harper was the PM in Canada. It looks like he's bringing it back to Parliament to be discussed at least and to be abolished. So that's we can all do our part. We can all help to make a change, and change we must. Otherwise, everything that our generations and generations of our people fought for, freedom of speech, human rights, will be lost.
Yeah, that's right.
So I give it back to Vicky, who will introduce our guest for tonight, Robert Spencer, who came extra from America. We had a wonderful tour. This is the last evening. Ladies and gentlemen, big welcome to Robert Spencer.
We've had a lot of fun on this tour, I must say, and yeah, we've had a lot of fun. We've got to know each other. So look, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you our special guest, Mr. Robert Spencer. You know, it's often said you need to know, when you're in a battle, you need to know the enemy. Now, Muslim people are not necessarily the enemy, but the Islamic ideology is an enemy to the state, to freedom, to human rights, and to the rule of law. So let's not pretend that it isn't. It is. And there's, you know, I've been really impressed. I've been to 2 radio stations now with Robert to listen to him answer questions, and he's really, that's his gift, and it's been amazing to listen to the depth of knowledge, his expertise, and we're just really blessed to have him here tonight. So Robert's going to share with us. He's previously presented to the US Central Command, the US Army Command, Asymmetric Warfare Group, the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force. He's the author of 10 books on the subject, including the New York Times bestsellers, The Truth About Muhammad and the Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. And of course, he's the director of the website Jihad Watch, which you know, informs people about what is actually going on, and there's not many websites that you get the accurate information. So look, all this stands in testimony to his courage and his commitment to freedom of speech. And so we're just so happy to have him here tonight. And as I say, and also he's a really nice guy, as well. So welcome, Mr. Robert Spencer.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for coming. I'm very glad to see that there are people who are concerned about these issues, and I thought that since I actually just read in a local paper right before I came here that there's a local politician, I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but he has asked his party and some local authorities to condemn the Q Society for resisting Sharia and for having me speak. And so I thought that as long as I'm here in the process of giving offense, I'd just give offense right away and get that part out of the way. And so, here you ready? Here we are. There was a young Muslim boy of my acquaintance, about 4 or 5 years old, and he was in the supermarket with his mother, but he got separated from her, and so he was crying, he was all upset, and finally they took him to the manager of the supermarket, and he said, what does your mother look like? And he said, I have no idea. Now, maybe you found that offensive. And that is actually the point. The point is, when we have a law, such as the law that required Vicky to read that disclaimer at the beginning, this ridiculous law that you have in the state of Victoria that Pastor Scott ran afoul of by telling the truth, the law outlaws, it forbids giving offense. But giving offense is, of course, entirely within the power of the person who is offended to choose not to be offended, to choose some other reaction. If you came up to me right now and you said, you know, you're a racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim bigot, I might be offended, but I might not be. I might think, well, you're an idiot. Or I might think, you're ignorant and you have no idea about these issues. Or I might burst into tears and run from the room. Or I might call the Human Rights Commission. But any number of things that I could do, I do not have to take offense. It is not required. It is not an automatic or necessary reaction to anything.
Absolutely.
And so, obviously, this is an elementary point that everyone knows. You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. You know, our mothers told us that you don't have to be offended when people call you names or they say something you don't like. They told you. They told me. So what happened? Did they not tell these politicians? Did they have deficient mothers? Obviously they know. They know what they're doing. And what they're doing is granting hegemony, granting a particularly privileged status to Muslims in Victoria. Because the person who decides what is hate speech, the person who decides what is offensive, in some spuriously objective evaluation, is the one who has the power to control the public discourse. The one who can decide that something really is offensive and needs to be prosecuted as such is a privileged class who has an ability to withstand criticism because you're not allowed to give him any. And this is the reason why in our civilization, Western Judeo-Christian civilization, such as has been elaborated in Australia and in the United States of America and in Europe, we have freedom of speech to begin with because people realized that it was the fundamental bulwark, our strongest safeguard against a tyrannical ruler running roughshod over the will of the people by being able to stifle dissent. And because the founders of our nations knew that dissent was essential to the body politic in order to protect us from tyranny, they instituted freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is precisely in order, the laws protecting freedom of speech, that is, such as still exist, they are precisely designed for offensive speech, for speech that somebody might find offensive, for speech that bothers people, that bothers tyrants, that bothers those who want to perpetrate an agenda under the noses of others without being stopped, without having it being pointed out to them what is being done, so that there can be resistance. And so when that's gone, then forget it. All bets are off. Not only that, but when Victoria instituted this anti-freedom of speech law, and of course, that's just one. Canada has them, as Warren was talking about, and the United States of America even though we have the First Amendment that protects freedom of speech, the First Amendment to the Constitution, the Obama administration actually joined with the government of Egypt in the summer of 2009 to co-sponsor a non-binding resolution at the United Nations that called upon member states to criminalize religious defamation and insults and denigration and vilification of religions. But of course, says who? Is it vilification? All these years I've been doing this and people say, you hate Muslims, you hate Islam, and so on. And I constantly think of a quote from St. Paul in the New Testament. Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? And if the truth is vilification, we're in big trouble. But the law in Victoria and the Obama administration joining at the UN with Egypt to call upon member states to criminalize religious hatred or vilification, the Canada hate speech laws, and all similar laws everywhere else, they are, coincidentally, absolutely in line with Islamic law's provisions regarding what is permissible for non-Muslims to say about Islam and how they must behave with respect toward it in the Islamic State. What a coincidence. Isn't that funny that the laws would be designed and the laws would be largely used only or almost only by a group that also has a legal system and a system for society and governance that forbids and denies the freedom of speech. But of course, that was the whole point. That's why the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, formerly known until recently as the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is 57 Muslim governments, 56 states, and the Palestinian Authority, the largest voting bloc at the United Nations today. That's why they have been pushing at the UN for laws that would restrict the freedom of speech. Not only would such laws render us mute and thus defenseless in the face of the advancing jihad, whether that jihad be violent or non-violent, but also they are part of a larger program to bring Islamic law to our societies and to force it upon us. And under the guise of sensitivity to minorities and a desire to resist racism, even though Islam is not a race and there are Muslims of all races who are pursuing this agenda, the authorities in Victoria happily aided in their agenda of bringing elements of Islamic law here. Now, of course, they have no clue that that was the agenda. They have no idea that that was what was going on. Because, of course, they don't know anything about Islam except what they have been told by smooth and smiling deceivers. And also, they know that these people are victims who are being discriminated against and who therefore need special treatment so that they can enjoy the protections of our society. Now, of course, the discrimination is spurious just as much as the rest of it. I can tell you that the latest FBI statistics for hate crimes in the United States are just the same as FBI statistics for hate crimes in the United States every year. Muslims are down at the bottom of the list. Nobody's really bothering them. And yet, hate crimes against Jews are right at the top of the list. And yet, and I expect that it's probably the same way, much the same way here. And yet, how much do you read about Islamophobia versus a resurgent anti-Semitism? Not only that, but the Muslims have made this agenda abundantly clear. It isn't as if they have been shy about telling us what their intentions are. They've been perfectly clear about it. They've been perfectly forthright about it. And yet the authorities still, they somehow missed it. It's as if they have their fingers in their ear and they're saying la 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 la. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, the teachings of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, the elaborations of those teachings by Islamic jurisprudence and by the various sects and schools of Islam, they all agree. All of them, without exception, all of the mainstream orthodox sects of Islam, all of the schools of jurisprudence, the teachings of Muhammad in the Hadith, the traditions of his words and deeds, which are normative for Islamic law and practice, and the Quran itself, they all agree that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against non-Muslims and to subjugate them as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law. This is part of the program that absolutely upfront about it. I'll show you. I was in London a while ago, and while I was there, you know, it was a little bit of a vacation. I visited mosques. And, you know, what else was there to see in London? And so...
And I let you in.
Yeah, well, I didn't tell them I was coming. Anyway, so I was in London going to mosques, and I went to the Finsbury Park Mosque, which you may have heard of because it was the mosque of Abu Hamza al-Masri, who is known popularly as Captain Hook. He was an imam at the Finsbury Park Mosque in London who, in an excess of piety one day while he was making a holy Islamic bomb, it accidentally detonated and he lost an eye and a hand, and so he has a hook for a hand, and that's hence his nickname. But in any case, Captain Hook is gone now. He was famous for saying things like, one time he said in a sermon at this Finsbury Park Mosque, that the kuffar, that's us, the unbelievers, or at least most of us, are like cattle, and you can catch them, you can milk them financially, you can kill them, you can do whatever you want with them, they're yours. And he acted on this. So he was involved in various terror plots and so on, and now he's in prison. So I went into the Finsbury Park Mosque a little after all this happened, and they were very nice, and they didn't know that what I do for work. But in any case, I was accosted by a young man who was very happy to see me because I was not a Muslim, and he weighed me down with books to convert me to Islam, and one of them was this Quran, which is a very nice edition of the Quran, as I'll explain in a moment. And I asked him, I hear that there's been some trouble here. I hear that you had some difficulty with some of the earlier leadership. And he said, oh, yes, there were some extremists, but they're all gone now. And everybody here now is peaceful and moderate. And he gave me this peaceful, moderate Quran. And it's really very helpful because this Quran has context in it. Have you ever noticed that whenever somebody like me, or maybe somebody like you, whenever you quote the Quran, it's always out of context? I never have managed to quote the Quran in context. You know, if, like, for example, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, which is chapter 2, verse 191, chapter 4, verse 89, and chapter 9, verse 5. It's 3 times in there. I've never quoted that in context, but I do wonder, have you ever wondered, what would be a context in which I mean, unless it said, here's what you better not do, right before that. But it doesn't. Anyway, so I get this Quran, and it's got context written by Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi. Now, Maududi was a Pakistani theologian and politician. He was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia party in Pakistan. And Maulana Maududi, as he was known, Maulana is an honorific, a title that shows that he was a very wise man. He died in 1979, but he was a really extraordinary writer, and his writings are found anywhere. If you go to your local Islamic bookstore, and I know you probably all have an account there, and just ask them for the writings of Maududi. They will probably show you that they have his multi-volume commentary on the Quran and maybe some other things. He made a brilliant speech about the theory of jihad, which is frequently republished. And his commentary on the Quran is digested in this handy 1-volume Quran with context. Now, Maududi is as mainstream as you can get. He's, as a matter of fact, the University of Southern California, which is not, as far as I know, a Sharia state or an Islamic madrasa, The Muslim Students Association there, several years back, they set up a very handy, searchable online Quran and Hadith collection. It's interesting to note that a few years later they changed its name to the Center for Muslim-Jewish Engagement and took out the search function recently. And I think, why are they making it less useful? Unless maybe they don't really want you to see what's in there. But anyway, they had commentary by Maududi on that site until they started to clean it all up. And Maududi is internationally respected, internationally influential, very mainstream. So the verse, remember that we've been discussing about it's part of the core program of Islam to subjugate us, to deny us basic rights, and to establish Muslims as a privileged class who have rights that the non-Muslims do not enjoy. Now, think about that in light of the free speech laws, or the anti-free speech laws. They establish Muslims as a special class who have rights that we do not enjoy. Now, because, you can insult and vilify me all day, but there's no way the court would take the case, would it? But, my goodness, if somebody didn't like that joke, then, they'll be leading me out of here in handcuffs. So anyway, chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran is the foundation for this idea that Muslims must have rights and privileges that non-Muslims do not have. And it goes like this. It goes something like this. Fight against those who do not believe in Allah and do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, that's us. The people of the book is the Quran's designation for primarily Jews and Christians, also Zoroastrians and some others. Fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued. Until they pay the jizya, a tax that non-Muslims pay in the Islamic State and Muslims are exempt from paying, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Well, of course, I've just done it again. I just quoted the book out of context. But luckily, I have my moderate, peaceful Quran from the Finsbury Park Mosque, after all the troubles were over, and it's got context from Maulana Maududi himself, so let's go. Sorry, I had it bookmarked, but the bookmark is gone from that one page. The purpose for which Muslims are required to fight is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. Well, that's a relief. The purpose is not to compel us into embracing Islam. After all, we hear in another verse that is oft quoted by television commentators and Islamic spokesmen, there is no compulsion in religion. Chapter 2, verse 256. So it's not to force us, it's not to compel us to embrace Islam. So what is it for? Rather, its purpose, that is the purpose for which Muslims are required to fight. Its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people. People. I mean, not just some people.
All people.
All people. That's an extraordinary revolutionary statement. It's saying, as Maududi himself actually puts it, just so that we keep this in context. Maududi puts it in his larger multi-volume commentary on the Quran. He says this, and I quote, "Non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, the believers are under the obligation to dislodge them from that power by any means possible." So, here he says, the authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. That's Islam, for those of you who are just joining us. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. And that state of subordination is called Victoria. The unbelievers have to live in a state of subordination. That is the premise and the principle and the foundation of the socio-political jihad. And it's happening right under our noses right now. The purpose of a free speech law that makes it a crime to offend Muslims obviously establishes Muslims as having rights and privileges that non-Muslims do not have. The purpose of all the stealth jihad initiatives is the same. It is not just to win accommodation for Muslim practices. It proceeds by claiming that it's all about trying to win accommodation for Muslim practices. But that is clearly not the only agenda. I'll give you an example. The J.B. Swift Company is a meatpacking company in the United States. And it has plants in Nebraska and Colorado, among other places. And in those plants, both of them, it has imported huge numbers, by the hundreds, Somalis to come into the plants and work. So that in each of those plants, about half of the workforce is Muslim, Somali Muslim immigrants, and the other half are non-Muslims. So in both of these plants, the Muslim workers started walking off the job when it was time for prayers, the 5 daily prayers. And of course, you're talking about mass production. You're talking about what's essentially an assembly line in the modern form, such that there is very precise timing for the jobs that have to be done. And they're gone, they're walking away. So everything gets fouled up. Fouled up with a W because it's chicken. Anyway, then they of course were fired, and of course they sued, and of course they won. Because the United States has the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which mandates that businesses have the responsibility to make reasonable accommodation of particular religious practices. And so they declared that giving these guys breaks for prayers was reasonable accommodation for particular religious practices. End of story, except it wasn't. Then what happened, nobody expected. Then what happened was that the non-Muslim employees complained, and it was really great because they were all black and Hispanic, and so nobody could say, oh, they're racists. But anyway, they complained because they were having to work longer days to make up for these guys' disruption of the schedule and their special breaks. And so they were saying, now you're discriminating against us. You have placed non-Muslims in a special privileged position, and they have rights and privileges that the non-Muslim employees do not have. You got to convert to Islam to get those breaks. Now see, that's exactly the agenda. That's exactly the point. Because remember the passage, remember the verse, and remember how Maududi put it in context, that non-Muslims must live in a state of subordination. The verse says they have to pay the tax, the jizya, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And Islamic law elaborates throughout history a remarkable, detailed list of ways in which the non-Muslims have to feel their state of subordination. Because you see, the Muslims have the responsibility to bring about the just and perfect society on earth. That's their job. They've been given that by God. The Quran says, you are the best of people among the nations of the earth. It's chapter 3, verse 110. By contrast, the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings. That's chapter 98, verse 6. So, which one should rule in a society? Obviously, the believers, the best of people, should rule the society according to the law of Allah, and the unbelievers should live, the most vile of created beings, must live in a state of subordination. If they are not living in a state of subordination, the Muslims have the responsibility to put them there. That's what it said. Fight against the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So, we see it happening exactly in the way that they have planned it. The meatpacking plant gave the Muslims the break times, but you see, the point was not the break time at all. The point was that they have rights and privileges that the non-Muslims don't have. And so the non-Muslims are living in a state of subjugation. They do not have the rights that the Muslims have. In prisons in London, there are young men who are converting to Islam in the prisons. Now, of course, there's a targeted effort in England and in the United States, and I suspect probably here also, to convert people in prison to Islam. But this is not that. There are young men converting to Islam in prison because you get better food. Because you get halal food. And, you know, prison food, nobody goes to prison to because the food is good. And yet, when you start getting in catered meals that are carefully halal, then it really does improve significantly in quality. And here again, Muslims have special privileges that non-Muslims do not have. That's the whole idea of dhimmitude, of the state of subjugation that the non-Muslims live in. The idea is that because we have rebelled, because we have rejected the truth of Muhammad and Islam, then we have to be made to feel punishment for that in this life and in the next. In the next, of course, we'll all burn in hell, but before that, they have to work to subjugate us. And because that is part of the establishment, you see, of the perfectly just society, in which the truth shines forth, and those who reject the truth, those vile created beings, they are subordinate. But the thing about this is that the state of subordination that is mandated is also sorry, second. Where's the Now, where were we?
State of subordination.
Yeah, state of subordination, Victoria. The Muslims, you see, are the executors of God's wrath in this way, in a way that the Judeo-Christian tradition does not allow for. The idea that vengeance is mine, says the Lord, and I will repay, and the idea, of course, that there can be no perfect human society on earth. These are things that we take for granted in the West, and that we understand in the context of the Judeo-Christian tradition. These things are completely at variance with Islam. In Islam, the perfect society is established and maintained by a reign of terror. And that perfect society features Muslims having rights and privileges that non-Muslims do not have. And the idea of that, you see, this state of subjugation is designed to bring us all in to Islam. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, he said, when you meet the unbelievers, invite them to accept Islam. That's dawah, proselytizing. Invite them to accept Islam. If they refuse, invite them to pay the jizya. That's the tax. In other words, invite them to enter the Islamic social order as inferiors. If they refuse both of those, seek Allah's help and go to war. Conversion, subjugation, or war. But the idea of the dhimma, the idea of the subjugation, is also designed to bring us in. If we don't accept the invitation, and we don't get killed, and we are subjugated under the dhimma, the rules for the non-Muslims, to live in this state of subjugation, then the idea is that we will feel our deprivation all the time. We will be suffering because we have rejected Islam. We will have to pay this tax. We can't have authority over Muslims. We can't build new houses of worship or repair others. We're taking these menial jobs because, of course, we can't have authority over Muslims. We have to get off the sidewalk if they're walking by because they are obviously the superior, the best of people. And we can get out of all this just by converting to Islam. And so, you see, it all tends toward bringing us in. There is no compulsion in religion, and the purpose, as Maududi said, for which the Muslims fight is not to force us to accept Islam. It is to subvert our societies and subjugate us so that then we'll accept Islam freely. Because it's so much better than living as a serf, or essentially a slave, living without any rights whatsoever, living a precarious existence that can be removed any time. I mean, that a precarious existence, the protection of which can be removed at any time. That's what dhimma means, protection. And a dhimmi, a zummi, is somebody who is protected. And the idea of dhimmitude is that we are protected in the Islamic State. But what are we protected from? The Muslims. It's like the mafia. You saw The Godfather, right?
Yeah.
It's the last movie I saw. I don't get out much. And in The Godfather, you know, it's the mafia. And they have a protection racket. They do other things too, but one of the things that you pay to the mafia is protection money. You know, you have a very nice store here, it would be a shame if something happened to your nice picture window. You pay us a couple $100 a month, I make sure nothing happens. Protection. But of course, if you don't pay, then your window is smashed, because they're the guys that are there protecting you from. It's the same thing with this. If you are a dhimmi, subjugated under the rule of the Islamic State, and then you get out of line, then you're dead. Your contract of protection is forfeit. Now, how do you do that? How do you get out of line? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. According to Islamic law, if you say something impermissible, notice I didn't say untrue. If you say something impermissible about Allah, Muhammad, Quran, Islam, then no more protection. Now, what is impermissible about Allah, Muhammad, Quran, or Islam? What is impermissible? Well, let's hear again. Don't listen to me. I'm just a racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim bigot. Let's go to the Islamic sources. And so in Islamic law, you can look it up. Slander. What is slander? Is slander telling lies about someone? Not according to Islamic law. According to Islamic law, you commit slander when you say something about someone that he does not wish to be known. And so in other words, you can tell the truth. You can say exactly what the case is, but if they don't want you to know it, then that's slander. And so what is it that they don't want us to know about Allah, Muhammad, Quran, or Islam? Well, obviously, it's just the sort of things that I'm telling you now, and that's why the people, the authorities who formulated the law in Victoria don't know these things, because they've been lied to. And of course, they've been lied to because not only is Islam the only religion with a doctrine, theology, and legal system mandating warfare against and subjugation of unbelievers, but also Islam is the only religion that sanctions deception in order to spread. And so these guys are being lied to, and if we tell the truth, then that is slander, and we lose the protection. And so, in other words, the authorities in Victoria are acquiescing to the implementation of Islamic blasphemy laws, and laws that are made for the dhimmis, for the subjugated people, that disallows them from saying truths about Islam that are inconvenient, that they don't want known. The deception is founded on the Quran, chapter 3, verse 28, which says, "Do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them." Oh, and he who does that has nothing to do with Allah, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. Now, here again, don't believe me. Maududi, he says, "This means that it is lawful for a believer, helpless in the grip of the enemies of Islam and in imminent danger of severe wrong and persecution, to keep his faith concealed, and to behave in such a manner as to create the impression that he's on the same side as his enemies." To behave in such a manner as to create the impression that he's on the same side as his enemies, but he isn't really on it. Now, clearly, if Muhammad taught that he has, as he said, I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there's no God but Allah and that I'm his messenger. And if the Quran says that they have to fight us until we're subjugated, and it also says that they can lie to us in order to protect Islam when they feel threatened. And then we see that all our governing authorities are listening to Islamic authorities who tell them that Islam is a religion of peace and has perfectly benign intentions toward Australia. But then at the same time, they are pushing these initiatives that always have the same feature of asserting the primacy of Islamic law over our own laws and the primacy of Islamic customs and practices over our own, and demanding that we change the way we do business, change the way we bank, change the way we educate our children, change the way that we maintain our institutions in order to accommodate them. Well, isn't there some cognitive dissonance there? And doesn't it just completely dissipate? And doesn't it become completely clear what's going on as soon as you consult the Islamic sources? And see, oh yeah, well, here it is. Subjugation, special privileges, lying, and they're falling for it, just like that. But of course, all is not lost. All is not lost because, after all, we are here tonight. We're not in prison. And maybe some of us will go later. Make sure to convert to Islam to get the good food. But anyway, I still have every confidence that we can win this. Obviously, our governing authorities, our law enforcement authorities, and the mainstream media are in complete state of subjugation. And they are letting this initiative of stealth jihad gallop forward at great speed. I mean, really, who would have imagined all this 10 years ago? But at the same time, we do stand for, and we are the children and heirs of, a civilization that is superior to Islamic civilization. Imagine a civilization that does have to forbid dissent. Imagine how insecure that shows you to be. I mean, you know, if we encounter the kind of person who bridles at any criticism, even the slightest thing, and gets angry and won't hear it and throws you out, well, we think that person is rather dreadfully insecure, do we not? And it's a brittle culture. It's a brittle civilization. They can't stand the slightest challenge. And so all we have to do is challenge them and they'll fold. It's just like the schoolyard bullies. Once you stand up to them, you may get a little scraped. But the bullies, they're not used to resistance. And they'll just keep going and pushing until you push back. Now, there are millions of Muslims in the West now. And many of them have come here because they actually do prefer our civilization that offers freedom of speech and the freedom of conscience and the equality of rights of women and the equality of rights for non-Muslims. And there are millions of Muslims who are here because they are muhajirun. It's a very hallowed concept in Islam. It means emigrants. And the first emigrants were Muhammad and the early Muslims. When they left Mecca 12 years into Muhammad's prophetic career and moved to Medina, where they had been invited to take up residence, and Muhammad would be for the first time a head of state and the head of an army, and the people in Medina would convert to Islam. And so the emigrants, the muhajirun, were the people from Mecca who came to Medina to bring Islam to them. And it's absolutely clear that what we have in Australia is exactly the same phenomenon. Many, many Muslims coming here in order to bring Islam here. Not Islam as a religion, but Islam as a political and social order. And that is part of the key to defeating this. This has all happened because this is a religion. If Islam were a completely secular form of political governance that made no mention of God and did not have a book or a prophet, then this would have been easy. And it would have been outlawed years ago. Because it is an authoritarian, even totalitarian system that is absolutely at variance with basic freedoms that we have always enjoyed in our societies. But it's because it's a religion and because we guarantee and respect and revere, and we should, the freedom of religion, that it is galloping so quickly toward hegemony. But it's a political entity. It's a political system with a political agenda. And the more we understand that, and the more we are able to communicate that to the people that are around us who have no clue about any of this, the more we are going to be able to bring public pressure to bear on Islam as a political system, subject to all the scrutiny that political entities generally are. And that is the key to defeating it. In the United States, there are 20 states, I believe it is now, that have considered anti-Sharia legislation to outlaw Islamic law. And yeah, it's great, except there was one state, Oklahoma. You saw the musical, right? There was one state that, while the wind came whipping down the plain, 70% of voters voted to outlaw Sharia. But then a judge, a Clinton appointee, said, no, you can't do this. It interferes with their religious freedom. And all of the anti-Sharia initiatives are stalled because of this ruling. Now, there's a saying that is growing more and more frequently repeated in the United States, and that is that the U.S. Constitution is not a suicide pact. And the idea of religious freedom, just like all the other constitutional guarantees, is not so absolute as to have to be enforced even at the expense of the national interest. In the 1890s, as a matter of fact, the United States government outlawed polygamy and told the Mormon Church, which was in Utah, which was a territory at the time, it was applying for statehood, and the U.S. government told the Mormons that they would have to outlaw polygamy or they would not make Utah a state. And the Mormons outlawed polygamy. God told them it was okay. He's always changing his mind with the Mormons. And they outlawed polygamy, and Utah was accepted as a state. And nobody was saying, oddly enough, you're infringing upon their religious freedom. Everyone understood that the religious freedom was subject to the national interest. And it becomes even more clear if Islam and Islamic groups in Australia and in the United States and in Europe were to be understood as political entities and not as religious ones. We stand for and we enjoy in our societies a superior set of values, one that has enabled a flowering of the human spirit such has been unparalleled in human history. And that is extraordinarily attractive. If we stood up for ourselves and we stood up for who we are, then also this would not be happening. It's only because the West, in Australia, in Europe, in America, has suffered a massive failure of will that this is happening. But Pakistan has no illegal immigration problem. Neither does Egypt. Nobody's trying to get in there. People are trying to get out. And they're trying to come where? They're trying to come here. And then here, we're allowing them to recreate how it is there.
That's right.
And so, I think that it's useful to recall, in conclusion, I'm just learning about Australia a bit since I've been here, and wonderful country and very beautiful place, and this is a delightful city. I was walking around this morning, and anyway, there's this money, and I was asking people, who are these people, And this is Mary Gilmore on the 10. And it turns out Mary Gilmore is a poetess, and I take it on faith. I'm way too old to read it, but in very small print here on the 10, actually a bit of the poem that I'm about to read. And it sums up the situation that we're in and the kind of spirit we need to recover. Dame Mary Gilmore, interestingly enough, was a socialist, I'm told. And nowadays, she would be called a radical right-winger for having written this. Sons of the mountains of Scotland, Welshmen of Coombe and Defile, breed of the moors of England, children of Erin's green isle, we stand foursquare to the tempests, whatever the battering hail. No foe shall gather our harvest, or sit on our stockyard rail. Our women shall walk in honor, Our children shall know no chain. This land that is ours forever, the invader shall strike at in vain. Anzac, Tobruk, and Kokoda, could ever the old blood fail, no foe shall gather our harvest or sit on our stockyard rail. So thank you very much. We'll take some questions now, but it's just a matter of standing firm, standing up, enforcing our own laws, being who we are, and then there's no doubt in my mind that we will prevail over this. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, wasn't that great? Well, we're going to take some questions now, and at the end of question time, can I just ask you to remain seated, because I'd like to ask our President, Jeff Dixon, to come and say a couple of words in conclusion as well. And with the questions, if we can just keep them to 30-second questions, please. No statements. Hire your own hall if you need to do that. So just, and I'll try and watch for your hands, and then I'll point to you, and you get, and so that Robert can focus on the questions. So to start with, we'll take over here. Thanks.
Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good day.
G'day. What do we say?
I'll work on it.
What do we say to those when we try and raise these issues that everyone in the room obviously is aware of? When most people say, "Oh, I know plenty of Muslims. They're all good people. You know, they're just like us.
Yes.
You know, and they just." And I've actually worked with some, and you just sort of have a talk with them. They say, "Oh, all that stuff. We don't believe in that."
Right. Yeah, that's the my friend Ahmed syndrome. My friend Ahmed's a beautiful guy. He's a gentle soul. He wouldn't hurt a fly. And I go to his house for Christmas, and he's a wonderful guy. So everything you're saying must be false. My friend Ahmed fallacy. There is in Islam a spectrum of belief and knowledge and fervor among the adherents of the religion, just as there is in Christianity, Judaism, or anything else. And as a matter of fact, every human society is characterized by people who adhere very much, and it means everything to them, the beliefs of the religion, or the beliefs of the party, or the organizational goals, or whatever, and they know all about it, and they can explain it and defend it, and they love it, and they live by it. And then there are others who couldn't care less. But if you ask them, they'll say, well, yeah, I guess I'm a Christian. Yeah. But they haven't darkened the door of a church in years, and they don't, or maybe Christmas and Easter. And it's the same thing in Islam. There are people who know all about it and care very much. There are people who don't know anything about it and don't care. There is every gradation in between those two. And so you cannot extrapolate from the individual that you might meet really anything about Islamic teaching or Islamic theology or Islamic goals in Australia or the United States. The individual may not be tied into that at all, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The Catholic Church says that it's a sin to practice artificial contraception. About 70% of Catholics, according to polls, practice artificial contraception. Does that mean the church doesn't teach that? No, it just means most people ignore it. Islam, all the sects and schools of Islam, teach that it's part of the responsibility of Muslims to wage war against and subjugate unbelievers. You will probably meet Muslims who couldn't care less about that, may not even know about it, and are going about their lives. Does that mean that Islam does not teach jihad warfare against unbelievers? Unfortunately, that would be a fallacious conclusion.
Oh, I'll go one-sided, yes.
G'day.
G'day. Was that better? G'day.
Robert, do you think or perhaps believe that Occupy is part of the stealth jihad?
Occupy. Do I think that Occupy is part of the stealth jihad? Yes and no. Occupy is a useful idiot. It's a tool. The leftists and the Islamic supremacists are good friends and close allies. And they have worked together for years. And people find this odd. And people ask me about this all the time. Don't they know that they're going to kill the homosexuals, and don't they know that they're going to close the clubs and outlaw alcohol and all that? And you know, these people are leftists. What are they thinking? Well, I think that in the first place, there is a very deep connection that they actually do have. It is a marriage of convenience. It is a case where probably both sides think they can use the other and discard it once they're through with their immediate goal, which is to defeat us. That is, the guardians and defenders of Western civilization. However, my friend Jamie Glazov, who's the editor of Front Page Magazine, which I highly recommend, frontpagemagazine.com, he wrote a book, United in Hate, which I also highly recommend for this question. It's about this leftist jihadist alliance. And he suggests, and I think he's really onto something here, that there's actually a deep ideological kinship between the left and Islam, because they both envision an earthly utopia established by a reign of terror. Whenever the hard left has gotten into power, you know, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, all the rest of them, they have instituted a reign of terror. I'm not going to say anything about that. And they've instituted a reign of terror that in a slow motion way parallels Sharia, Islamic law, which also rules by terror. That is, you know, stoning, amputation, the death penalties for this and that, and the doctrines of warfare, and you're afraid, you know, people often think, especially religious conservatives often think, well, you know, these people, at least they're moral, and we should make an alliance with them on the basis that we're both moral people against secularism. But actually, Islamic morality is very hollow. It's based on fear. It's not really the cultivation of virtue and doing the right thing because it's the right thing. It's just doing the right thing so you don't get your hand chopped off. And in any case, you see the connection, that both of them have the same idea in mind, that they will establish the just society on earth, the perfect society on earth, and anybody who gets out of line will get it, will be done violence to. And so there is a connection between the goals of the two.
Thank you.
Over the side. Yes.
G'day.
G'day.
I
G'day. We'll work on it. The rain in Spain.
Sorry. I have a question about reverts.
Reverts, yes.
Especially, I guess women, young women. Like whenever I watch the YouTube videos of people who've reverted, they all kind of say the same thing, you know, like I read and I studied the Quran and it just all made sense.
Yes.
And I'm like...
That's all canned stuff.
Yeah, are they groomed? And what part of the Quran makes sense to them?
Okay. In the first place, let's talk about reverts. The question was, what is it about reverts that they all say the same thing, and that is that they read the Quran and it all made sense, and what part of the Quran makes sense? Now, first things first, revert. Every convert to Islam, as you probably know, is called a revert by the Muslims, because the Islamic doctrine is that we're all Muslims, and the original religion of all the prophets and all the biblical figures is Islam, and that we fell away, and that our forefathers, they twisted and hijacked the teachings of the Muslim prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus to create what we know of today as Judaism and Christianity. And so everybody who converts to Islam is called a revert. I would suggest, with all respect, that we not use this kind of terminology because we don't believe that everybody was originally a Muslim. And so I'm going to talk from now on about converts to Islam, not reverts, but I understand what you're saying. Now, converts to Islam often say, very often, that they read the Quran and it all made sense and everything fell into place. Now, there's a couple things you have to understand about converts to Islam. They get lied to just like everybody else. Islam has a doctrine of deception. And I actually have a very good friend who was a convert to Islam, and he was a very prominent convert to Islam, as a matter of fact. And he left Islam although he has not left Islam publicly because Islam also has a death penalty for apostasy. And even in the United States of America, in Washington, D.C., in 2011, he knows that if he comes out and says he's not a Muslim, he's going to have to watch his back. And so he is not a public convert to Islam, from Islam, but he's a very helpful fellow because he's tied into all the Islamic advocacy groups. He's all their friends, and he sends me their emails. But anyway, he has written, actually even while he was a Muslim, about the disparity, the disconnect between what he was told Islam was all about and what he found out it was all about when he got in. And there is actually a manual of dawah, of Islamic proselytizing, that I have in my office that, come on over, I'll show it to you. And it says that the potential converts are to be given a partial and concocted view of Islam. And then once they get in, you introduce them to the, quote, revolutionary aspects of Muhammad's teaching. And so they hear some things that may make sense. Because of course, Islam, of course, to black American converts, potential converts, is pitched as the religion that's free of racism. And the churches have a very poor racial record in the U.S., but Islam is free of all that, and brotherhood and equality and everything. They don't tell you about the Arab supremacism. You find out about that later. And what about the Quran makes sense? Well, that's another thing that my friend, the former convert, told me, is that he didn't actually read the Quran before he went in, but he was one of those guys saying, I read the Quran and it all made sense. He read pieces that they gave him. And then when he actually sat down and read it cover to cover, he said he was extraordinarily disappointed. He just kept waiting for the wisdom to show up. Actually, in the Arabic, it's even worse because about every fifth sentence doesn't really make sense. And that's the subject, part of the subject of my next book, which will be out in a few months. I used to say in the spring, and then I found out that was now. It'll be out in a few months, and it is called Did Muhammad Exist? And in it, I examine the historical foundations of early Islam, and actually they're quite shaky. And one of the things that makes them shaky is that the Quran is so scrambled and confused in many ways, and contains so many neologisms and oddities of grammar and strange statements that nobody knows what it's talking about. And there are some scholars who have done some really fascinating work in this regard. I don't know if you know how Arabic works, but Arabic letters are, most of them, 16 of them, are identical to at least one other letter in the alphabet in shape, except for the diacritical marks, the dots that go above or below. But the earliest Qurans don't have those dots. And so some people are having stripped out the diacritical marks that are part of the canonical text of the Quran, are examining it and saying, well, what else could this mean? And finding a very interesting Aramaic Christian substratum. It seems that it was some sort of an Aramaic Christian text that was repointed as part of the efforts of the early Arab empires to create this religion that would give cohesiveness to that empire. So anyway, stay tuned for that. It'll be at any self-respecting bookstore, March or April.
Anyone on this side?
Oh, yes. I'm not picking.
At the back there? Yes, you? Yes.
I was going to say, what questions do Muslims don't want you to ask about their faith?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What questions do Muslims don't want you to ask about their faith?
Oh, what questions do Muslims not want you to ask about their faith? Well, bearing in mind that they'll lie, they'll take any question. But Islamic spokesmen will not usually be honest with you if you ask them about the doctrine of deception. They'll say it's a Shiite thing, that taqiyya, which means covering, it's also the name of the head covering, the little hat, you know, that looks like a doily. The doctrine of deception was actually formally developed by the Shiites, who are the minority in Islam. They're about 15% of Muslims worldwide, and they were ferociously persecuted by the Sunnis throughout all of Islamic history and today. And So they developed this doctrine of deception that they could lie and say they were Sunni and conceal their Shiite identity in order to escape persecution. And that's what you will get from Islamic spokesmen if you ask them about this doctrine of deception. And they'll say, then they'll probably be Sunni because they are most Muslims. And they'll say, we reject that. We don't have that. That's just a Shiite aberration. But the problem is it's in the Quran, as I quoted to you. And there's another passage, chapter 16, verse 101, that I did not quote. I gave you 328, which says you can not take unbelievers as in preference to believers as your friends and protectors unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. And you see that there's another Islamic authority who explains that verse by saying we smile in the face of some people, but behind their backs we curse them. Anyway, there's another verse, 16:101, which says that if you deny your faith, if you're a Muslim and you deny that you're a Muslim, you'll go straight to hell. Unless you're in grave danger, and then you can pretend that you're not a Muslim. So in any case, that's one. Another one would be about the doctrines of warfare, and they'll tell you that the doctrines of warfare were restricted to the time of Muhammad. And that verse that I quoted to you, 9:29, that says, fight against the unbelievers, fight against even the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, they'll say that only has to do with the people of the book who were in Medina at Muhammad's time. But in the first place, that's total nonsense. It makes no sense that the verse would only apply to the people of the book of Muhammad's time and none thereafter. Because Muhammad himself, in a hadith, he says, be sure to collect the jizya, because it is the source of livelihood for yourselves and your descendants. And most Islamic authorities, when they interpret the Quran, when they are explaining the Quran to Muslims, they say that the passages that are from Medina, the later part of Muhammad's career, take precedence over the earlier, chronologically. And unfortunately for us, the passages that do enjoin warfare against us, including that one, 9:29, come at the latter part of Muhammad's career. So according to Islamic theology, they take precedence over the earlier. That's the mainstream view. Also, one would have to wonder about why a perfect and eternal book would be revealed in which large portions of it only apply to 7th century conditions that will presumably never be repeated, when it's supposed to be the guide for human behavior for all time. And so these are very common things that you'll hear from Islamic spokesmen, and I could go on and on, but those are two where it's not that they won't like the question, they just won't tell you the truth about it. And if you ever do get to ask a Muslim spokesman the question, I will bet you $100 that the answers that I just gave you will be the answers that you'll get from them.
Yes.
Robert, thank you very much for everything you are doing.
Thank
Would
you.
it help? Yes. Would it help the cause if tonight we were to vote on a resolution and to pick one at random? Australia's immigration policy should be designed for the benefit of Australia, and therefore we require an indefinite moratorium on Islamic immigration. Now that's just one of many possibilities. But would it help the cause if you were to invite us to propose such resolutions and vote on them and record the result?
Well, it would be great, but I'm not quite sure I understand. Do you mean if the Q Society or the people at the Q Society meeting voted on this resolution, or if we were able to prevail upon our governing authorities to accept it?
Well, all I'm suggesting is that when so many good people are together,
Yes.
and thanks to yourself generally of one mind, the impact of such a gathering is invariably more profound if there's an expression of the view of the gathering.
Ah. Well, I don't have any objection to that, certainly, but I would like to see rather...
That's more for the Q Society.
Yes, I'd like to see that introduced as something that would actually be considered by legislators. And that would be, of course, all to the good, because it's not that every Muslim is bringing this program to Australia, as I explained before. But there's no way to distinguish the ones who are from the ones who aren't. And so any kind of moratorium like that would be certainly in the national interest. The problem is that both Australia and the US are ruled now by internationalists who don't have the national interests of the country as their first priority.
But there are many other opportunities. For example,
Yep,
female genital mutilation is something that is absolutely rejected by
Indeed.
society.
Yes.
Or
Okay.
those sort of-
Thank you. Actually, you, yes.
Just a quick question.
Sorry.
Obviously, our politicians' capitulation on what we were just discussing is a major problem. What kind of advice?
Speak up, please, can't hear you.
It'll
I'll
be
repeat it.
repeated.
Yeah,
It'll be
I'll just say,
repeated.
what kind of advice would you give us as people to try to influence our politicians to wake up to this?
Where are you from?
Canada.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, I can't do the good day either.
Up in there. Obviously, the capitulation of our politicians is a major problem. What can we do about it? Fair summation? Well, vote them out and put them in jail. Of course it isn't. And so the first thing we have to do is raise awareness. The problem that we face in the fact that these quislings are ruling our countries is that there aren't enough of our fellow citizens who are aware of this problem. And so the absolute first foundational thing we have to do is raise awareness. And there is every opportunity that we have to do that. You are going to encounter people tomorrow in your work, in your school, whatever. You are going to encounter people who think that it would be mad for you to be here, and who think that you might be a racist.
Yesterday, actually.
And you have a chance to explain these things, and a responsibility to do so. We are the soldiers in this war. There is no other group and no other individual who is going to do this for us. We have to do it. This is not a conventional war. The army is not going to help. The government is obviously not going to help. The media is not going to help. Who does that leave? Us. We have to do it every day. Try to think of something that you can do that you would not otherwise have done. Something that you can do to preserve this republic and to defend it. And to preserve the values of our civilization. And there are numerous opportunities will unfold before you. But mostly it will be simply about trying to convince somebody else who does not have a clue. And once we gain critical mass, then we'll be able to affect political change. And see, the thing is, it's going to happen. Because the more they push, the more people wake up. Every time they win, they lose. When they get special accommodation somewhere, when there's some crazy decision made by some crazy judge to allow them special privileges that others do not have, more people wake up. And they are our friends and allies. We have to find them, bring them to the Q Society, bring them in, and make them work.
Yes, down the back there.
G'day, Robert. I've chatted to you a few times on Facebook, and I've reposted probably hundreds of your Jihad Watch blogs. The problem and I think a lot of people here are having is, I'm after suggesting, like, how do you wake the younger crowd up, the younger generation, to what's going on? Because, as you can imagine, most of my mates are in their 20s and early 30s. All they give a rat's ass about is who's going to win footy on the weekend.
Rob would have mentioned that we've just had a few young people.
Yes. The question is about how do we wake young people up? And I can't say actually when was it now and where? If it was
Tuesday in Sydney.
If it was Tuesday, it must have been Sydney. And there was a good group of young people there. And there was one who was not with them who was there to challenge me, and we had some fun. And there were others, however, who were completely energized about this. And so I offer that to you as a sign of hope that you're not alone, and there are others. And meanwhile, at the same time, the answer to your question is the same as the answer to the general question of how you wake anybody up. That they're not going to see it until they see how it impinges upon them. And so you can bring that about. You can start to point out to your friends and allies things about alcohol and things about clubs. You know, there was that Australian, was it Ben Brica? Who said that when we have Sharia in Australia, then alcohol will be outlawed, and we're going to close down all these clubs. And so show that to them and say, see, you know, I'm not making this up. This is a matter of concern. Oh, it'll never happen. Well, then show them how it's happening. Show them what's being done. But it's an educational thing, and we all have to be the educators.
Yes.
Thank you. Good evening, Robert. Bill Bowser.
Good evening.
I have a proposal to offer to you for your consideration. You mentioned during your talk that this is all happening because Islam is a religion. You also mentioned in how many ways it's not really a religion as we know a religion. As a long-term strategy, it might seem a bit oversimplified, but one way to push the bully back, why don't we take the measures necessary in each Western society to deregister Islam as a religion? It then has no protection as a religion and becomes a political organisation.
Why don't we take measures in Western society to deregister Islam as a religion and remove its protections therefrom such that it is by default a political organization? I certainly have no objection in principle to attempting to do that. Of course, that's not going to happen in the current political climate. And also, I'm a bit uncomfortable with it only because Islam is a religion. And I know there are a lot of people around who like to say Islam is not a religion, but it is a religion. A religion, if you look it up, what is a religion? A religion is something, a system of beliefs that purports to relate mankind to God. And Islam does that. So Islam is a religion. But you're quite right that Islam is not a religion in the way that we think of religions. And it is much more than a religion. And the more that it is political and supremacist. And so certainly we need to classify Islam as a political entity in our countries. And if that can be done by declassifying it as a religion, I'm certainly not going to stand in the way. But I think that it opens us up to a vulnerability of attacks from the opposition saying, well, obviously these people are nuts because Islam is a religion. And so it's better to say Islam is a religion and also a political entity with a political agenda that is inimical to our rights and freedoms. And so as a result, we have to classify it as such.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned the correspondence between the hard left and the political jihad. In fact, they've got some common. What about the soft left, which of course is more of a problem in Western societies, and this what seems to be the use of one religion as a way to tear down Christianity, as a way to tear down the Judeo-Christian heritage. We've got a group of infidels already, who are basically the political class in the society, and they have this hubris and arrogance which says that all religions will collapse because of the superiority of the atheistic or agnostic view, and they cannot see the possibility of any other outcome. Isn't this a fundamental problem? They will use every weapon, including Islam, to attack what you were talking about, us as the inheritors of the greatest culture on earth, the culture we were saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The soft left is the subject of the observations and the idea. Why is it that the political left in our countries, the more mainstream left, why are they alive? I spoke about the hard left before and the reign of terror and so on. Well, actually I touched on it briefly, the reason for the alliance, and it's just exactly what you're saying. I think that's because that's the objective. The objective is the destruction of Judeo-Christian tradition and the destruction of the right in Australia and in the United States and in Europe. And they think because they underestimate the power of religious appeals, they really don't take Islam seriously. But they see that these people are set against the West, so they can use them, and then they think they'll be able to take care of them easily. I think they're going to be rudely awakened in that regard. But the alliance has been revelatory. We see that with the feminists. We found out now, everyone ought to know here, that the feminist movement doesn't really care about women at all. Because if it did, it would be at the forefront of fighting against genital mutilation and honor killing and the subjugation of women by polygamy and all the other elements of Islam that restrict women's freedom and rights. But they don't. As a matter of fact, I've written several articles that you can find in the Jihad Watch archives of profiling feminists who actually defend these things.
Sontag.
And, oh sure,
Sontag.
and who say that it's the Muslim women, they're happy in this, in wearing this thing and being subject to men in these ways, and so you can't say anything about it. And of course, that's never a courtesy that they accorded to Western women in the 1960s. Didn't matter if they were happy or not having a job and being in the home and so on. And so we see that the real objective of the feminists is not to defend women at all. But what trumps that is this shared common desire to destroy Western civilization.
Yes.
I refer to the Q Society handout on halal food and certification. Here it says that half of the beef in Australian shops and supermarkets is already halal. Logistically, how does that occur as per the definition of halal in this handout in a mass beef production facility that usually gets a bolt through the head in Australia? Do you have all these people standing around slitting throats, hanging the animal up and saying the prayer? Technically explain the process.
Oh, so it's just the
Explain the process of halal, how it's done. Well, it does, yeah, you do slit the throat of the animal and Islamic prayers are said. That's how it's done. How it's done in a mass production environment, I do not know. I'm sorry that I haven't studied meatpacking, but I would expect that, yeah, it's that the slitting of the throat is done in a machine way. And I do actually know, because I've just been involved in a controversy about this in the United States, that the Islamic prayers are not pronounced over every individual animal, but over lots of them. And so that's one thing that speeds up the process. As far as the statistic, it's absolutely accurate, and there's actually probably it's higher, because the meatpacking industry in the United States as well is apparently operating according to the principle that, well, the Muslims care about this and nobody else does, and so we'll just make all the meat halal. And
Woolworths are doing it now.
a lot of it is out there, it's halal and it's not labeled as such. And so people with a religious objection or an animal cruelty objection or an objection simply because the halal certification is probably done by groups with ties to jihad terror groups, people who object to it on whatever grounds have to stand up and demand that the meat be properly labeled. And why should 50% of Australian meat be halal? 50% of Australians aren't Muslim. I don't have any objection to halal meat being available as long as there's an alternative.
Could I just direct? Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. Just if you'd like to have a chat to Jeff at the end, if you're interested in that, because he's done a lot of research into halal in Australia, and also there's a website, halalchoices.com, and there's a lady, Kirley Smith in Sydney, who's done a lot of research into halal, and you get information from there too. But it's for another time, that question. But see Jeff afterwards. Oh.
Got a tough one. How do you respond to claims that the perceived inherited primacy of the Jewish culture is not or is barely different to that which you're assigning to the Islamic culture?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So how would you respond to claims, this is the kind of question my friends are going to ask me,
Yes.
that the perceived inherited primacy of the Jewish culture in the Judeo-Christian...
The perceived inherited primacy?
Yeah, like
That's
you
the
talked
idea
about,
of
you talked about the Islamic culture believe they are, there's a primacy they have.
Oh,
that
they're the best of people.
Correct.
Oh!
How do you respond to claims that that is no different to...
Oh, it's extraordinarily different. Yes, I understand now.
So maybe highlight 3 things that you could show me that...
Absolutely, absolutely. The question is, how is the idea that the Muslims have that they're better than everybody else different from the idea that the Jews have? Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, or, you know, Judeo-Christian, you know, we're an inheritance, there's an inheritance.
Okay, well, in the first place, if you're talking about from the standpoint of moral relativism,
Yep.
and saying that all cultures are equal, then consider that if one takes that to its logical conclusion, then World War II would never have been fought and Hitler would be the master of Europe and we might be speaking German now, because you can't judge the Nazis. That's their culture. And so if your friends are simply moral relativists, then that's easy. Obviously they don't operate as moral relativists in the world today. Obviously they take for granted a certain set of values that involve things that are very like the Ten Commandments. And they probably take umbrage at people who kill, commit adultery, steal, and so on. And these things are manifestations of the fact that human beings are indeed constituted in a particular way and have a moral compass, whatever their belief system may be. And so to say that something is just as, every culture is just as good as every other, is to allow for monstrous evils that have been perpetrated by various cultures, and to judge them as just the same as cultures that do not perpetrate those monstrous evils. That's one thing. But if you're talking about at the same time the idea of a chosen people and the idea that the Jews are the chosen people, that's very different from the Muslim idea that the Muslims are the best of people. The Jews understand, and the Christians also believe, that the Jews are chosen by God in a particular way. And yet, there is no hint anywhere, especially in the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, nothing in there that would suggest that the Jews believe themselves to be better human beings than non-Jews. As a matter of fact, there's quite a bit to the contrary, because the Jews are so self-critical and honest about their failings that their own scriptures and their self-critical nature has been used against them by Christian anti-Semites and by Muslims. And the Muslims routinely, actually, even to this day, speak about the Jews as the killers of the prophets and so on and so on. And they're reflecting Islamic traditions that were taken over from Judaism itself about the Jews being nasty to their own prophets. So the idea of chosenness is a matter of a responsibility, but it does not confer upon them, in their own understanding, any actual superiority of any kind. Whereas in Islam, the superiority is frank, it's open, and it's foundational. It's right there, chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran. You are the best of people, whereas the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings. And so it's two separate things, and so I hope that that covers it. But if they're just relativists, well, that's just sort of nonsensical. And if they're worried about the other, that's different. That's another one.
You can ask him.
Yes, Vicky.
Oh, sorry.
It's just a comment. To help you, I have written this little critique of learning from one another. That's book prepared by Muslims for our primary and high school. It's 50 pages. It will give you sufficient information to debunk Islam. You'll find it very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
America, Europe, and Australia, we've always felt ourselves defenders of democracy and always pushing that agenda. Was in Iraq and Afghanistan pushing that. You've highlighted several flaws with democracy in being able to defend itself against Islam, and in Europe we see in governments importing Muslims as ready voters, and obviously legislation getting pushed through democratic courts allowing furthering of Islam. Would you consider that democracy is fundamentally incapable of defending itself against Islam, or the contrary?
No, I don't think democracy is incapable of defending itself against Islam at all. I think that what we see in the initiatives that you outlined is more the function of the moral relativism that I was discussing for the last question. And that the guardians of our democracies have lost their moral compass and their values and lost their appreciation for our own culture. They swear, you must do that here, right? They swear to protect the nation and to uphold its laws, and then they betray it. And so if they simply did what they pledged they would do, then these things would never go through. And most of the stealth jihad initiatives are not a matter of people voting by majority for the initiative itself. It is something that's mixed in with something else that they're voting for, or it's done under cover of darkness and deception. I have every confidence that the vast majority of Australians, and I'm talking about 90% or more, would stand with us if they really realized what was going on. And so I actually have great faith in the democratic process. And if we can get the word out, and if we can break the mainstream media monopoly on information, then people will flock to this cause. And democracy will be the salvation of Australia and the United States and Europe.
What about existing countries in the Middle East? For instance, recently there are elections in Iraq, and George Bush was credited with saying that if the Iraqi people vote in an Islamic government, then that is the will of the people and that is democracy. But wouldn't you say that when democracy is unable to deliver liberty and justice, then it is fundamentally flawed? Like, what happens when the majority is Muslim, when they reach that 51%, and then it is the will of the people, what then?
Yeah, you're quite right. The democracies of Australia, United States, Western Europe, they were formulated by people who had deeply imbibed the Judeo-Christian tradition, even if they were not believers themselves. They were working from Judeo-Christian values. And they understood that the majority of the populace shared those values. You know, when they put freedom of religion into the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, I am sure that nobody had in mind a radically repressive and rapacious totalitarian ideology that was going to eat up all the other religions and spit them out. Nobody envisioned that. They were talking about Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians living side by side with not one of them having the upper hand. And so democracy transplanted to the Middle East. You know, George Bush, he criticized those who said it'll never work, like me. He didn't name me by name, but he said, he doesn't return my calls either. And he said that, you know, they said that it wouldn't work in Germany and Japan after World War II. And yet we brought democracy, and they are shining democracies today. And I do that one better now. But the thing about Germany and Japan is that the ideologies that had fueled the militarism in both countries were defeated, were prostrate after the war. Whereas in Iraq, Islam was the fuel of the militarism, and it was not prostrate. As a matter of fact, it was encouraged. The United States oversaw and underwrote and financed the implementation of Islamic law, of Sharia as the highest law of the land in the constitutions of both Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. That is a fundamentally anti-democratic system that denies, I mean, you can't have democracy without freedom of speech and dissent. And you can't have democracy where significant elements of the population are disenfranchised. And so the whole thing was self-contradictory. And in a place where most of the people believe that's the law of the supreme being, not to be questioned, and superior to any man-made law, then obviously there's no way that a Western-style republic could ever take root.
What do you think's going
And so I'm not saying that democracy at all costs has to be pursued. As a matter of fact, those are states with authoritarian traditions. They've never had anything but authoritarian rulers. And so whatever authoritarian ruler they have, if he allows for the non-Muslims of the world and of his country to live in relative peace and stability, that might be all we can ask for. But to spend millions and billions and blood and treasure and men and materiel and all sorts of things to try to make Afghanistan into Palm Beach, it's just never going to happen.
No. Okay. Yeah?
One more?
One more question.
One more?
Okay, at the back there.
Okay. Robert, do you think with the Copts in Egypt that we are looking down the barrel of another Holocaust?
Yes. Do I think that the Copts in Egypt are looking down the barrel of another Holocaust? Most certainly. The Arab Spring is really an Islamic winter. They're imposing Islamic law. The Muslim Brotherhood won the elections as expected. They're going to try to transform Egypt into an Islamic state. I expect it will unfold much the way it did in Iran in the 70s, when the Shah was betrayed by Jimmy Carter and he fell, and the Ayatollah came in with an alliance, a coalition with leftist groups. And one by one, he killed them all, imprisoned them all, and eventually laid the foundations for the Islamic Republic. And now the Muslim Brotherhood is talking about a coalition with leftist groups. The same thing is playing out, exactly. And this spells disaster for the Copts because they have been resisting it and because they had relative equality of rights under the Arab nationalist regimes of Nasser and then Sadat and then Mubarak for the last 50 years. And now the responsibility, remember I said this during the talk, of the Muslims to make sure they feel themselves subdued. And they have not been subdued. And so now they're going to get it. And so, yes, the real scandal here is that the world community and the so-called human rights apparatus doesn't pay any attention. They couldn't care less if it's Christians. Because Christians are from the big bad West that dominates the world and oppresses everybody else. And so if some non-white, non-Western Christians get killed, well, really it's all George Bush's fault anyway, and so it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't hold in much grief for George Bush, but this is the kind of way that they think and that they talk. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Fight, never give up, never give in.
Our President Jeff Dixon to come in and thank Robert, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things. We didn't get Stealth Jihad, Robert's book. It didn't arrive in time, but if you want to order it, there will be 20 copies of it coming to Brisbane, so see Jeff about that. He's also got a little book at the back Michael's holding up called Islamophobia. It's only $5 and it's a great little read, and that's through one of Robert's little booklets. And also when we